You chose her over me, Daniel.
Emma, I made a terrible mistake.
You don't know the truth yet.
What truth?
The secret your family hid from you.
On the night Daniel Whitfield chose to humiliate his wife in front of 40 dinner guests, he had no idea she once turned down a fortune to marry him for love alone. The marble floor beneath her knees was colder than any winter she remembered from Ohio, and Emma Calloway pressed the cloth against the stone with the same quiet discipline she had carried since she was 19 years old, scrubbing floors that never once belonged to her. She wore a modest gray dress, plain against the gold lights spilling from the chandeliers above her, and though she now wore the name Whitfield, nothing in this house had ever truly felt like hers. Laughter rippled across the room. Crystal clinked. And somewhere beyond the crowd, her husband's hand found the curve of another woman's waist, as though Emma were no longer standing there at all. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The tray in Emma's hands began to tremble first, before her heart caught up to what her eyes had already understood. Champagne glasses shivered against one another, a small, delicate sound lost beneath 40 voices toasting to a company that was already dying quietly behind closed office doors. Daniel Whitfield did not notice the tremor. He was too busy laughing at something Vanessa Cole had whispered against his ear, too consumed by the warmth of being told he was brilliant to notice the woman who had loved him before he had a single dollar left to his name. Emma set the tray down slowly on the nearest table, her hands steady now, though something inside her chest had gone completely still, the way a house goes quiet in the exact moment before a storm finally breaks. She had not always been the woman kneeling on borrowed marble. 5 years earlier, Emma Calloway had been a hotel housekeeper from a small town outside Columbus, Ohio, the kind of town where people worked with their hands and measured a person's worth by whether they showed up, not by what they owned. She met Daniel Whitfield during the worst season of his life, 3 months after a car accident had taken his first wife and left him limping through hallways he no longer recognized as home. He had inherited an empire he never asked for, a mother who measured love in shares and social standing, and a grief so heavy that most people around him treated him like glass. Emma did not. She spoke to him plainly, refilled his water without being asked twice, and once told him bluntly that his self-pity was beginning to smell worse than the untouched breakfast tray in his room. That honesty was the first thing that made Daniel Whitfield fall for her, though neither of them called it that at the time. He began finding reasons to linger near the East Wing where she worked. He learned, clumsily and without instruction, how to make his own coffee simply because he wanted an excuse to sit across from her in the small staff kitchen instead of eating alone in a dining room built for 12. When he finally worked up the courage to give her a gift, he chose something expensive, a gold watch that cost more than her mother's entire house back in Ohio. Emma handed it back to him without hesitation and asked instead for something smaller, something that actually meant something. She asked for a photograph of his late mother, the one woman in his family who, according to the staff who remembered her, had never once treated the people who worked in that house as anything less than human. Margaret Whitfield never forgave Emma for that request, though she never said so directly. Margaret was Daniel's mother-in-law from his first marriage, a woman who had married into wealth herself decades earlier and had spent every year since guarding it like something that could be stolen from her in her sleep. She watched Emma with narrowed, calculating eyes from the very beginning, unwilling to accept that her son-in-law's affection could be won by someone who once cleaned toilets for a paycheck. "She scrubs floors, Daniel," she told him once, her voice low and precise, the kind of voice used by people who have practiced cruelty until it sounds like concern. "She will never scrub off where she came from, and neither will you, if you keep her." Daniel did not listen to her then. He married Emma anyway, in a small ceremony with folding chairs and wildflowers instead of orchids, the kind of wedding Margaret called an embarrassment and Emma called the happiest day of her life. For 3 years, that happiness held, even as the money around them quietly began to disappear. Whitfield Logistics, the empire Daniel had inherited but never truly understood, was buckling under debts his late father had hidden for over a decade. Daniel, too proud to admit failure to the wife who had married him with nothing, began keeping secrets of his own, staying later at the office, avoiding conversations about numbers that no longer added up. It was during this fragile, unraveling season that Vanessa Cole arrived, hired as a consultant to save the company from collapse, though no one in that boardroom understood yet what she had truly come to collect. She was 29, sharp-eyed, effortlessly composed, the kind of woman who filled a room simply by choosing not to raise her voice in it. Emma noticed the change in her husband long before anyone else did, though she said nothing at first, not out of weakness, but out of a discipline few people in that house understood. She had grown up watching her own father survive hardship without ever once panicking his way through it, and she had learned early that fear rarely fixed anything worth saving. Daniel started missing dinners. He began defending Vanessa's late-night phone calls before Emma had even asked a single question about them. Margaret, delighted by the cracks forming in a marriage she had never approved of, began needling Emma at every family gathering, asking loudly whether a housekeeper really knew how to keep a husband interested once the excitement of the wedding had worn off. Emma answered these jabs with silence, though the silence cost her more than anyone in that room could see. One evening, while searching for old paperwork Daniel had asked her to find, Emma discovered a leather ledger tucked deep inside his late father's study, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. The numbers inside told a story far older than the company's current troubles, debts and transfers dating back decades. Names crossed out. One entry circled so many times the ink had worn thin against the page. She did not fully understand what she was looking at that night, but something about it unsettled her in a way she could not explain. A small, cold thread pulling at the edges of a mystery she had not yet realized she was standing inside of. She placed the ledger back exactly where she found it, and said nothing, though she never forgot the circled name. The dinner party that would break her heart in front of 40 strangers began, ironically, as an evening meant to celebrate hope, a fragile announcement that Whitfield Logistics had secured new investment and might finally be saved. Daniel had been drinking more than usual that night, buoyed by stress and relief and the intoxicating validation of a woman who told him constantly how brilliant his instincts were. Vanessa stood beside him for most of the evening, close enough that guests began to whisper, close enough that Margaret's smile grew wider with every passing hour. And then, in front of the entire room, in front of the staff who had once worked alongside Emma before her marriage lifted her into this world, Daniel placed his hand on Vanessa's waist and introduced her as the only person who truly understood what he was building. Emma's silence in that moment was louder than anything spoken in that room all evening. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She simply set down her tray, met Margaret's satisfied gaze across the crowd, and walked out onto the terrace where the cold air finally let her breathe. When Daniel came home hours later, guilt-soaked and unsteady, he found her waiting for him at the kitchen table, calm in a way that frightened him more than tears ever could have. "You didn't fall for her, Daniel," she told him quietly, her voice carrying none of the anger he had braced himself for. "You climbed toward her, because she reminds you of everything you were before you became someone people had to impress." He denied an affair. He did not deny how deeply he had begun to depend on another woman's admiration instead of his wife's steady, unglamorous love, and in that admission, the first true fracture in their marriage finally broke open. Margaret Whitfield did not wait long to seize the opening her son-in-law had carelessly handed her. Within days of the dinner party, she began circling Daniel with a patience that felt less like grief for his marriage and more like triumph finally allowed to surface. She reminded him gently, almost lovingly, that a divorce now would be simpler than most, that Emma had signed nothing extravagant, that a clean break would protect what little remained of the family's reputation. What Daniel did not know, and what Emma would only discover much later, was that Margaret had been quietly funding Vanessa's consulting position from the very beginning, orchestrating her arrival at Whitfield Logistics long before anyone believed her presence was anything more than professional necessity. Every conversation Margaret had once had about protecting the family, it turned out, had never been about protecting Daniel at all. Cornered by mounting debt, his mother's pressure, and a marriage he no longer knew how to repair, Daniel asked Emma for a trial separation, his voice unsteady, his eyes unable to meet hers directly as he said it. He expected tears. He expected pleading, perhaps even anger loud enough to match the guilt eating quietly at him since the night of the party. Instead, Emma nodded once, calmly, and began packing a single suitcase the following morning, moving into a small apartment across town, without raising her voice or asking him for anything he was not already prepared to give. Her composure unsettled him more than any argument could have, because for the first time in their marriage, Daniel realized he had no idea what Emma Calloway was actually capable of when she stopped trying to hold everything together for him. The timing of her departure could not have been crueler. Within the same week, Emma received a phone call from Ohio, informing her that her father's health had taken a sharp and frightening turn, his heart weakening faster than doctors had predicted only months earlier. She now carried two collapsing worlds at once, a marriage dissolving quietly behind her, and a father fading slowly ahead of her. Yet she allowed herself no outward collapse in either direction. She visited him every weekend she could manage, sitting beside his hospital bed in the same modest way she once knelt on marble floors, present, steady, unwilling to let exhaustion show on her face, where he could see it and worry. Her father, a man who had spent his life working with his hands and asking for nothing, never once suspected how much his daughter was quietly carrying on his behalf. Back at Whitfield Logistics, Vanessa Cole moved with a confidence that no longer bothered to disguise itself as mere professional ambition. She convinced Daniel, still reeling and desperate for any sense of control, to sign over a significant portion of company shares into a newly created holding entity, framing it carefully as a necessary step to protect his assets during the coming divorce proceedings. Daniel, trusting the one person who had told him repeatedly how brilliant he was, signed without asking the questions a calmer version of himself might have asked only months earlier. He did not read every line. He did not recognize the name quietly listed as the entity's second beneficiary, a name that would mean nothing to him, yet everything to Emma, had she been standing in that room to see it. Word of the signed documents reached Emma indirectly, through a former colleague still loyal enough to warn her that something about the new holding company felt wrong. She said nothing to Daniel. She did not call him, did not warn him, did not allow herself the satisfaction of proving she had been right about Vanessa from the beginning. Instead, she sat with the unease quietly, the same way she once sat with the mystery of her father-in-law's old ledger, waiting for the pieces to align into something she could actually prove rather than merely suspect. Somewhere beneath her calm exterior, a decision was slowly forming, one she had not yet spoken aloud, even to herself. That decision crystallized during a visit to her father's bedside, weeks later, when his voice, weakened but clear, offered her a story she had never heard in full before. He told her about a business partner from decades earlier, a man he had trusted completely, who had slowly drained everything they built together while smiling at him across the same table every single week. He told her he had never fought back, not because he lacked the strength, but because he lacked the proof, and by the time he understood what had happened, everything was already gone. He took her hand, his grip weaker than she remembered from childhood, and told her that the only regret he carried into old age was not the poverty that followed, but the silence he allowed to protect it. Emma left the hospital that night with something settled inside her that had not been there before, a quiet, unshakable resolve that had nothing to do with winning back a husband who had humiliated her in front of 40 guests. She thought, instead of the ledger hidden in that study, of the circled name she had never forgotten, of the holding company Daniel had signed without reading closely enough. She was no longer thinking like a wounded wife, hoping for reconciliation. She was thinking like her father's daughter, a woman who understood exactly what silence cost people who could not afford to lose anything else. The following morning, she made a single phone call to a forensic accountant she had once met through hotel work years earlier, and told him, calmly, that she needed his help uncovering exactly what Whitfield Logistics was hiding. Marcus Reyes, the forensic accountant Emma had once known only as a guest at the hotel where she used to work, listened carefully as she explained what little she understood about the ledger, the holding company, and the timeline that no longer made sense to her. He agreed to help, not out of favor, but because something in her voice convinced him she was not chasing revenge, only clarity. Together, working quietly over the following weeks, they traced the holding company back through layers of paperwork designed to discourage exactly the kind of attention they were now giving it. What they found was not a simple case of a company drowning in debt. It was a structure built patiently, over years, by someone who understood exactly how long it would take before anyone noticed the money moving. The deeper Marcus dug, the more one name kept resurfacing, buried beneath legal language and shell entities meant to obscure it. It was not Vanessa Cole's name that appeared most often in the earliest documents, but Margaret Whitfield's, listed quietly as an early financial backer of the very consulting firm that had placed Vanessa inside the company in the first place. Emma sat with this discovery for a long time before saying anything, remembering every dinner where Margaret had smiled while needling her, every conversation where concern for Daniel's well-being had somehow always ended with Emma looking smaller. She realized now that Margaret's disapproval had never simply been about class or background. It had been cover, carefully maintained, for something far more calculated. Marcus eventually located an old adoption record, filed decades earlier under a name that had since been legally changed, connecting Vanessa Cole directly to Margaret's late husband, Daniel's father-in-law from his first marriage. Vanessa was his daughter, born outside of his marriage and quietly paid to stay silent about her existence for most of her life, raised by a mother who never let her forget she had been discarded in exchange for a family's reputation. Margaret had known about her for years, had watched from a distance as Vanessa grew up excluded from an inheritance she believed, in some private and justified corner of her mind, should have belonged to her as much as it belonged to Daniel. This context did not excuse what Vanessa had done, but it explained the calculation behind every calm smile she had offered Daniel across a boardroom table. She had not simply wanted him. She had wanted what his family represented, the security and legitimacy she had spent her entire life watching from just outside its boundaries, and Margaret had recognized in her the perfect instrument for a much older grievance. It was Margaret who had first approached Vanessa, years earlier, not with an apology for the past, but with an opportunity for the future, a quiet promise that if Vanessa played her part patiently enough, Whitfield Logistics would eventually belong, in some form, to both of them. Emma now understood the full shape of what she was looking at, though understanding it did not make the decision ahead of her any easier. She could take what she and Marcus had uncovered directly to Daniel, exposing everything, including his mother's decades-long deception. Or she could walk away entirely, use the inheritance she had never claimed from her years of quiet hotel work, and build a life far from a family that had never truly made room for her. She thought again of her father's voice from his hospital bed, of his one regret carried quietly into old age, and she understood that walking away silently, however tempting, would only repeat the very silence that had cost her family everything once before. The final holding company transfer was scheduled to close within days, a signature away from stripping Daniel of any meaningful control over the business his father had built and hidden debts within for decades. Emma gathered every document Marcus had compiled, every record connecting Margaret and Vanessa to the shell entity waiting for Daniel's final approval, and drove back toward the same estate where she had once knelt scrubbing marble floors as a young housekeeper who believed in nothing more complicated than honest work. She did not call ahead. She did not warn Daniel she was coming. She simply walked through the front doors of Whitfield Logistics on the morning of the signing, carrying with her the one thing Margaret had never accounted for, the truth, fully assembled and impossible to dismiss. The boardroom on the 40th floor of Whitfield Logistics had been designed years earlier to impress. All glass and polished steel, the kind of room where decisions worth millions were made in hushed, controlled voices. Daniel sat at the head of the table that morning, a pen resting near the final transfer documents. Vanessa seated beside him with the same composed smile she had worn since the night of the dinner party. Margaret stood near the window, arms folded, watching her son-in-law with the quiet satisfaction of someone who believed the hardest part was already finished. None of them noticed Emma until the door opened, and by then it was too late to control the room the way they had controlled every room before it. Emma did not raise her voice as she walked to the table. She did not need to. She simply placed the folder Marcus had prepared directly in front of Daniel, open to the page connecting the holding company to Margaret's original investment, the same page that traced Vanessa's legal history back through a name she had spent most of her adult life trying to bury. "Before you sign anything," Emma said evenly, "I think you should know exactly whose company you're about to hand over and why." Daniel looked down at the documents, then up at his mother, confusion slowly hardening into something closer to dread as the pieces began arranging themselves in front of him. Margaret's composure broke first, faster than Vanessa's, faster than anyone expected from a woman who had spent decades perfecting the art of controlled cruelty. She began explaining before anyone asked her to, her voice climbing with a defensiveness that only confirmed everything the documents already suggested, insisting she had only ever wanted what was fair, what should have belonged to her family from the very beginning. Vanessa, watching the woman who had recruited her unravel in real time, said nothing for a long moment, her hands still on the table, her expression shifting from practiced calm into something rawer, something closer to exhaustion than triumph. When Vanessa finally spoke, her voice had lost its usual polish. She admitted, quietly, that she had never actually hated Daniel, had never needed to convince herself to dislike a man who had done nothing personally to wrong her. What she wanted, she said, was simply to stop being the daughter nobody claimed, the name erased from a will decades before she was even old enough to understand why. Her honesty did not undo what she had done. The shares maneuvered, the trust exploited, the marriage deliberately unsettled, but it gave the room something it had not expected, a version of the story where cruelty and grief had been sitting far closer together than anyone assumed. Daniel sat in silence for a long time after that, staring at the documents, at his mother, at the wife he had humiliated in front of 40 guests only weeks earlier, now standing in front of him with proof he had been too distracted to find himself. Shame settled into his face slowly, followed by something closer to awe, the recognition that the person who had protected him from losing everything was the same person he had nearly thrown away for a woman who reminded him of who he used to be before responsibility hardened him. He did not reach for Emma's hand. He understood, somewhere in that quiet, humbled moment, that he had not yet earned the right to. The legal consequences that followed were handled with the same quiet precision Emma had brought into the boardroom. Margaret lost her stake in the company entirely, her decades of careful maneuvering finally visible to a board that had once trusted her implicitly. Vanessa was given the chance to cooperate fully with investigators, returning what funds she could, avoiding the harsher consequences her mentor faced, a resolution that felt less like triumph and more like the closing of a very old wound that had never been given the chance to heal properly. Daniel did not attempt to rebuild his marriage the way he once tried to rebuild his company, with charm and urgency and promises made faster than they could be kept. He simply showed up, day after day, without asking for anything in return. Emma did not forgive him quickly, and she did not pretend the humiliation of that dinner party had disappeared simply because the truth had finally surfaced. She allowed him, slowly, to prove himself in the same unglamorous way she had once proven her own love to him, through consistency rather than grand gestures, through patience rather than persuasion. Months passed before she agreed to sit across from him again without a folder of evidence between them, and even longer before either of them spoke the word marriage aloud without flinching. What grew between them in that time was not the same relationship that had existed before the betrayal. It was something steadier, something neither of them took for granted anymore. A year later, Emma stood in a small office she had built herself, using the inheritance she had once been too humble to claim, running a foundation that offered legal literacy and protection to domestic workers who had spent their lives being underestimated the way she once had been. Daniel had rebuilt Whitfield Logistics smaller, leaner, working the floor of the company himself instead of hiding behind executives who had once hidden the truth from him. On a quiet afternoon, he found her back at the estate where they had first met, kneeling not out of obligation this time, but out of habit, teaching him, badly and patiently, how to properly clean a floor he had walked across 1,000 times without ever once noticing who kept it clean for him. She laughed, the first unguarded laugh either of them had shared since the night everything fell apart, and for a moment neither of them needed to say anything at all. The woman who had once turned down a fortune for love, and who had later refused to disappear quietly when that love was tested beyond recognition, had never actually needed saving. She had only ever needed someone willing to truly see her, and in the end, on his knees beside her on that same marble floor, Daniel Whitfield finally did.